Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's event with Nora Zelevansky in conversation with Nicola Kraus to discuss competitive grieving. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website by signing up for our email newsletter, as well as following us on social media at Book Soup and following us here on our Crowdcast page. Our next event is next Tuesday with Ben H. Winters and Kira Jane Buxton to discuss Ben's new book, The Quiet Boy. Past events are also available to rewatch here, as well as our YouTube channel. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. It's right to the left of the chat area, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. And if you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please feel free to click the like button, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. And please also feel free, as you are already, to engage with each other and our authors in the chat area. Also, please support Book Soup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, which you can do by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen. It'll redirect you to our website where you can finish the checkout process, and it will not interrupt viewing, so you can do that at any time. And we're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those interested, and I will share the links to those. We're also open right now for in-store browsing, so if you happen to be local to Los Angeles, please come by the store daily from 11 to 5. It is a really important time, as always, to celebrate and support, is what I meant to say, but celebrate too. Support independent bookstores and authors, so we would love to see you. And with that said, let me introduce our guests for this evening. Nora Zelevansky is the author of novels Will You, Won't You, Want Me, and Semi-Charmed Life. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, Town and Country, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Vanity Fair, among others. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband, 2 kids, and enormous cat, Waldo. Do we get to see Waldo tonight, or is he sleeping?
No, maybe he'll make an appearance. I'm hoping. We could only be so lucky.
And our other guest tonight, Nicola Kraus, is an American novelist most recognized as the co-author with Emma McLaughlin of the New York Times #1 bestseller, The Nanny Diaries, which was made into a major motion picture with Scarlett Johansson and Chris Evans. With McLaughlin, she published 3 other New York Times bestsellers, Citizen Girl, Dedication, and Nanny Returns. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Nora and Nicola. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. And thank you both so much for being with Book Soup tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. This is really wonderful. Usually you have to get on a plane to get to do an event in Los Angeles. So this is great. And thank you for organizing and hosting us so beautifully. I am just going to speak really briefly because I know I'm not the lady you guys came here to see, but I just wanted to take a moment to talk about how I first met Nora, which was actually through her work. I had been working with her husband, Andrew, and we'd been working together for quite a while before he came to me one day and said, my wife actually is an author and she has a book coming out, and would you be willing to take a look at it, possibly to blurb it? It's like, yeah, sure, of course. No, I'd be happy to. And I sat down and I was like, oh dear God, please let this be good, because otherwise it's going to be so awkward. And it was Will You, Won't You, Want Me? And I fell so in love with it. It's still one of my favorite books. I think about it like more than would make Nora comfortable. And then I had the opposite problem, which was I was so in love with his character. I was like, oh God, but like, what if she's not that at all? What if she's boring or harmless? Like that, then that'll be so awkward. And then I met Nora and I was like, oh my God, you're even more amazing than your book, which is just a delightful synergy when those two things just harmonize so beautifully. And then she became a member of my book club. And so I've had a professional and personal crush on her now for many years. And then the latest treat from her is this new book, which I have here, which is so wonderful. And I'm so excited that we're going to get a chance to talk about it tonight. So I'm going to start asking you some questions, if that's okay.
I'd just like to say that the crush is mutual, and that I was also terrified when we first met that I wasn't going to live up to the character when we met. So it all worked out happily.
It did. So I wanted to ask you first of all, what was your inspiration for writing this book? And also, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about the story of Wren and Stewart and George?
Sure. So just as basic background, we've been sort of saying that competitive grieving is a dark comedy and unlikely love story about loss and the aftermath of death. So it is a comedy about death, which is sometimes a difficult thing to understand, but so often actually it feels like those really difficult times and humor go hand in hand. So the inspiration for this book, in 2017, one of my oldest and closest friends died shortly after his 40th birthday. It threw me, as it would. And he had a lot of people in his world who felt really, really close to him. And he was like a very brilliant and magnetic person. And it was really important to many, many people in his life to feel recognized as somebody who had been special to him, only he was gone. So there was no way for anybody to receive that validation. And so, you know, in the best case scenario in that situation, everybody sort of bolsters each other and comes together and, you know, reassures each other that, of course, we were all important to him. In this situation, that isn't really what happened. Not entirely, but for the most part, instead, people became sort of competitive about their closeness and the version of him that they knew. And it was messy and it was sad and people were angry and it was funny and absurd at times. And after that experience, I literally had a moment where I was on the phone with one of my oldest friends and I was sort of complaining about the whole thing. And I couldn't believe that this is how this was happening. And I couldn't believe that he was gone and all of this stuff. And I said, it's like they're competitive grieving. And then I was like, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to call it Competitive Grieving. And that's not you usually don't start with the title, at least in my experience.
No.
So that's sort of where the inspiration came from. And the book itself is not the story, my story, or the story of what happened with my friend, but it is the story of the experience of the messy aftermath of trying to navigate someone's life once they're gone, and the trying to understand the relationships they had and learning things about them you didn't know and trying to reconcile who they are and who you are to them. And the more that I talk about it and the more that sort of people start to read the book, the more I've learned that this is like a very universal experience that doesn't get talked about very much. So that's competitive grieving. And, oh, I'm sorry. And the main character is Wren, and she has lost one of her best friends. And similarly is trying to navigate sort of the aftermath of that. And that's the story.
One of the things I really appreciated when I was reading it is that exact interplay that you achieved. The humor and the warmth and Wren's lens on life. She's obviously incredibly sad and heartbroken, but she's also still searching for connection and goodness. And it made it a really, really comforting read, which I think is something that we all need right now. And that I appreciate it as a fellow professional. That was not an easy thing that you pulled off. So my next question is, the typical advice for writers is to wait a few years before writing about anything personal in order to have perspective. And yet you started writing this while you were still grieving yourself. How did you maintain perspective on what this novel needed to be versus your own story?
Yeah, that's such a good question, like such an interesting question. And I've not been asked that. It's funny. I never knew. It makes total sense that you should wait a few years and like give yourself space the same way you would with like a draft of a book that you're having trouble with, that you have to like move away from so you're not too close to it. I didn't know that. And maybe had I known that, I would have. I guess at times my experience of working through my own grief probably did get entangled in the book in certain ways. But hopefully not to its detriment. The good and bad news about, as you know way better than anyone, the good and bad news about publishing a book is that it takes a really long time. And in this case, because of the 2020 election, the publication date for the book was even later than it would normally have been. So from the time that Blackstone acquired the book to the time to now is like, I think like a year and a half. And so the beauty of that is that I had space from it. And so when I came back to it to work on it with an editor, I hadn't looked at it in a long time. And I did in certain ways have to go back in and think a bit more about ideas of empathy and arc and things like that. As not just an expression of like my emotional reaction to what it is to lose someone, but what the story actually needed. On the downside, that meant I ended up editing it in the first few weeks of the pandemic. So
we were all so clear at that time.
Yeah, I was so focused, and there was so much childcare. So,
were there any characters that you found your relationship to them changing over the course of writing it?
Oh, changing. Interesting. Yeah, I think in a way, so the way that the story is told, for those who have not read it, the chapters are alternate between telling the contemporary story and Wren writing letters to Stewart or thinking messages to him. I guess it's dependent on how you interpret it. So it was really important to me and challenging to me to try to parse out the relationship between Stewart, who's gone, and Wren slowly throughout the book in flashbacks. And I actually think that Stewart is a character who changed for me a lot from the beginning to the end. I think that, I feel like this is going to sound really cheesy, but I feel like as I wrote him, it's like he surprised me. In that, I guess I could like bring myself back to a certain age, for instance, that I was writing about them in, and I could kind of remember more distinctly than I would have imagined what it was like to be in that time, and the boys that surrounded me and were close friends of mine, and what it meant to be a kid at that time. And so whereas it started out sort of with this idea of him being kind of, well, he's like a rising TV star. So with him being kind of superficial in certain ways, and that kind of thing, he evolved, like for me, as he does hopefully in the book, into like a much like richer person, like a deeper, more dimensional human.
He absolutely was.
Oh, good.
One of the things I love so much is that it's a story of mourning and a story of hope and the new beginnings that endings bring, which, as I said, feels very necessary right now. How did you go about finding that balance? And also to say, like, Wren and George, like their whole energy is just so lovely, and it's a really essential respite. And you were able to find that balance between the two different sort of energy cores running through it. So what was your process?
Yeah, I think that I sort of was just, I think that I am really drawn to stories that have depth, but also moments of like air and like escape. And I am drawn to stories that have like sadness and sweetness, but also like, I keep calling it like a bite almost. And so I think that, and as you know, and as many people, anyone who's lost someone knows, the process of grieving is very like, it comes in waves, it's experienced in waves, sort of moments of intensity, of numbness, of, guilt, of forgetting for a minute, like all of these things. And so I think in some ways I ended up writing the book in that sort of wave form, where there were moments of like real hopefully real poignancy, but also then moments of levity after them, like to let the air out kind of, you know? And I think that's just kind of how I have to live. Like, I know that we've all learned a lot about ourselves in the last year. And one thing that I've learned about myself is that I absolutely need hope. Like, I absolutely am driven by like optimism in a way that I really would never have thought of myself as being. And so the story is too, I think. And I also think it's why I love like a romance, or like rom-coms in general, and stories like that. I like a happy ending, you know, but I also feel like I need some depth along with it.
But it was just so brave, for lack of a better word, to be like, I am going to tell this story about mourning and grieving, and it's going to be a rom-com, and those two things are going to work seamlessly together. Trust me. Did you tell your agent about that before you did it, or were you just like, here, you're going to love it?
Yeah, no. In fact, I wasn't even working with my current agent yet at that point. I just felt like maybe more than any other sort of book I've written, I just felt so compelled to write this story. The experience was so specific, and there was so much fodder in the experience, just in terms of like our humanity, and the way that we interact with each other, and these fundamental like ways that we need to feel seen, and all of this stuff, that I just was like, I'm going to write this story. I think I did always know that it was going to be like sort of, I think in my head at the beginning, it was like a satire. I mean, the title is about grief, but it's also like, you know, a bit ironic. And I guess that's sort of my approach to dealing with hardship also. Like, I need the humor so badly, to the point where sometimes I have to like stop myself and realize that like not everyone feels that way.
I do. You can be inappropriately funny with me whenever.
I know that. I know that's part of why. That's part of why the connection. Yeah, no. So yeah, I mean, and it was a challenge, just being completely transparent. There were definitely people who were like, it's a romantic comedy about death. Actually, like, we started thinking about it once Faye read it, and she really fell for it right away, which was wonderful, my agent. And she was like, her first response as soon as I sent it to her was, "This is the best title I've ever heard." And I think she's gonna like it. Like, if she gets that, I feel like she's gonna get it. And we started to try to think about comp titles, as you do, like similar books. And we had a really hard time. So there are a lot of movies and TV shows that deal with death and comedy, but there are not that many books that do it. So we had a bit of a challenge, like trying to figure that out. But luckily we did, and luckily Blackstone didn't think we were crazy.
I think it's so exactly what we need right now. You know, like, because we're trying to process all of this as a world, and yet we're also fucking fried.
Yeah.
So if someone handed me a really serious book on the subject right now, I'd be like, nope, no thank you. Having lived alongside you during this experience, I was expecting a version of what you had been through. I was expecting the character of Stewart. I was expecting the friends. George was such an unexpected treat. And I was like, oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad George is here. Which brings me to my next question. I wish there was a 24/7 Nora Zelevansky banter channel. I do watch it all the time. What is your favorite part of books to write?
Oh, well, so dialogue is definitely like my it's what comes most easily. That's what comes easiest to me. Not as opposed to speaking English, which doesn't come very easily.
At this hour.
At this hour. It's late. We're in New York. Yeah, so writing dialogue is definitely my sweet spot, and I love it. I love interacting with people that way. So I think it's just like how I also write on the page, and it's fun for me to like imagine as like an old married lady. It's fun for me to imagine like and remember what that kind of banter is when you first meet somebody. And so I definitely would say that that's one of my favorite parts of the book to write. And then the other part was probably the funeral planning. So throughout the book, Wren starts imagining people's funerals and like how they would be, like the music, the food, how they would be buried, like that kind of thing. And it starts out sort of with people she knows, and then it starts to be about like any stranger she sees on the street or interacts with. And I had like the best time ever writing those funeral arrangements, just sort of envisioning, you know, what based on a person's character or personality, like what the ceremony should be and that kind of thing.
With your gift for dialogue, are you adapting this as a screenplay? You should.
Oh, well, that's a really good question. Thus far, I am not. Somebody might be. I hope. Actually, that sort of speaks to what you were saying about perspective. I almost feel like I'm too close to it, at least right now, to adapt it and to know what would be essential to the story, and what would be dispensable. I'm even having trouble saying the word dispensable about any of it because it's so new. You know what I mean? So it would be really interesting, and hopefully will be really interesting to me to hear like takes from other writers on what they think, if this was adapted, like what it would look like. And how it would have to shift and change. Because also it's in some ways would be something that was voiceover heavy potentially, because there's all these like letters to him. So it's like, how do you approach that? And I don't know. It's definitely interesting to think about.
How do you balance all your journalism with your creative work? Because you're also a fantastic journalist who's constantly writing for clients and publications. How do you make time for both things? And do you have one thing that you prefer more than the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, you know, like the word time at this point after the pandemic, if you have children, especially small children, it's like triggering. I'm like, I don't have time for anything. I am fortunate to be a very fast writer. So there's that. And as my father once said to me before I had kids, when I told him that I wanted to wait to have kids because I was nervous that once I had them, I wouldn't be able to write anymore. He said, you'd be amazed once you have kids what you can do with a short amount of time. And that has proved to be extremely true. You know, the journalism in some ways supports the fiction. I feel like I get to have these kind of interesting, amazing experiences and be inside these different worlds, whether it's like I'm doing travel writing, so I'm like, you know, all of a sudden in a different country, or if it's because I'm writing about wellness, and so I'm meeting all these like sort of crazy, weird wellness characters. I feel like in some ways the journalism is fodder. And what I love about the journalism is the finite nature of it. Like it's small, it's bite-sized in a way. It requires very specific structure. And when you're writing as a freelance writer, which I've been for years for various different publications, you have to adapt your voice in a very specific way for each publication. Ideally, like your voice comes through too, but it has to be in the vein of what the brand they're sort of projecting. And so when that fits together, that always feels a bit like the puzzle clicking together, you know, like the last piece of the puzzle. And it's really satisfying to me. but it's also much more constraining than writing fiction, as you know, because, well, I'm not someone who outlines or anything like that. So I just sit down and I have an idea, like a loose idea, and I just start writing. And that is like an amazing outlet when you actually can find the time, going back to time, to get in that headspace and do it. And I think I was saying to someone last night that because of the nature of being like a parent and working all these sort of other freelance jobs and whatever, I do get sort of smaller snippets of time, and I have literally written entire chapters while sitting in the passenger seat of our car on our way to visit like my in-laws in DC or Maryland while the kids are asleep in the back seat and Andrew's driving. But it's just, you never know, as you never know when you're going to get inspiration and have to like, my example is always like jump out of the shower soaking wet while you're like trying not to destroy your phone and type on it, So I guess thank God for notebooks and phones so that you can like note apps.
I have lots of weird little wet Post-its everywhere.
Do you go back to them? Because what I find is I often write something and don't go back to it.
I will go back to it and be like, what? What does that mean? Like, it's such a weird internal snippet. Or I'll write in the dark, like not wanting to fully wake up. And then in the morning, it's just illegible hieroglyphs. And I'm like, oh, that was a bad idea.
The middle of the night idea.
Got it.
Yeah, the middle of the night idea is always the least like legible and also like reasonable in the morning. Like you look at it and you're like, what? Yeah.
I don't fantasize about being that person sleeping by themselves, but I do fantasize about being that person who could just reach over, grab my phone and dictate without having to reach for a pen, but I would wake someone up and they'd be very angry.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for mothers with young children trying to finish?
Yeah. I'm like, don't do it. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I know. Don't do it.
Don't do it. But do I mean the novel or the kids? No, I'm kidding. No. I think it's just, I always just think it, whether you're writing with small children or you don't have small children and you're a writer and you just find it, you find yourself stopping or getting frustrated with yourself or the idea. I always think that like pushing through the times when the writing's not coming is like the best piece of advice I can give. But you know what the other piece of advice is, as far as I'm concerned?
Childcare.
Childcare, yes. 24-hour. No, no, but also there's all these ideas that you're supposed to like wake up at 4 a.m. and right before you work and like, or like Stephen King does it this way and never used an adverb in his life, or like, whatever it is like that. And I think that sometimes those, while maybe intended to be inspiring, those stories are actually intimidating and a little defeating because maybe you're just not the kind of person who's going to be able to work for 4 hours before work or 4 hours after work, and then go to sleep and wake up and be able to function the next day, or maybe you can't write every day. Mm-hmm. So I guess my advice would be to figure out what your process is that actually works, because putting pressure on yourself is what stops you 100%. Like that's what gets in your way. And also childcare. Also
that'll do it. I wanted to take a look into, if I can, this is going to be I am looking for the questions. That is what I'm doing.
Oh, I don't know if there are any yet. I don't know if there are any yet. Everybody needs to ask questions. I did want to say one thing.
See any, but that could be Book Soup if you're there and there are questions and I am just technologically challenged. Please jump in and let us know what those questions are.
Oh, there's a question.
There are no questions yet. Okay. Oh, now there is. This is like the magic garden.
But can I actually just address one thing really quickly that you brought up that I didn't really address? You just mentioned that the book is so is such a good fit for this moment. And I just wanted to address that because I obviously wrote this a long time ago, long before I had any sense that there was going to be a year and plus that we've had. Frankly, I did have a sense that there was going to be 4 years like what we had. I still maybe not as extremely as it was, but things definitely were feeling fraught, but I didn't realize where we were going to be. And like I said, there was a long wait to publication, and I was nervous about it. You know, I was legitimately concerned, like, you don't know how the world is going to change. You don't know how people's tastes are going to change. You don't know if the story is going to be relevant. And, you know, so much about the success of a creation, whether it's a book or a movie or an artwork or whatever piece of music, is about timing on top of it being, you know, hopefully good or whatever. And I just feel like there's something so synchronistic about the way that this ended up happening, that this book about grief, but also about like hope and like trying to find a kind of like way to commiserate and a sense of catharsis, but also a sense of lightness, light at the end of the tunnel, would come like right now when there's been all this collective loss, when there's all this collective grief of not just of people, but also of like a way of being, a way of living, a sense that the world was stable in a way that we thought we could rely on. And also a light that we're sort of beginning to see at the end of the tunnel, we hope. You know, we're all a little afraid to say, but like, it feels like, really feels like the right moment to me and for the book. And I really hope it helps people. Like, I hope that it gives people a laugh, and I hope that it gives people the cathartic cry, you know, and that it makes people feel less isolated in what is a pretty universal experience.
Yes, I think we'll do all those things.
Thank you.
4 questions. This is very exciting. Okay, so beginning, piggybacking on the outlining. I don't outline either.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just keep going and go back later to edit? Or do you stick with a chapter until it's finished and then keep going? Do you take random notes you know you might use somewhere, but maybe not yet?
Oh, that's a good question. I write from a place of anxiety. So I have to write, I like to write everything before I go back. And that's partially comes out of the first book that I wrote with National Novel Writing Month. And in National Novel Writing Month, you're not actually allowed to edit or stop, because the whole sort of point of it is to get out of your own way. And stop doing that thing where you write like 2 chapters and then decide it sucks, your idea sucks, and you know, bail on the whole thing. So that's how I wrote my first book. And I guess that's kind of, even though I don't necessarily do it in November and write the amount of words I'm supposed to write every day and all of that anymore, I do try to get it all out, because for me, there's a kind of calmness to editing that doesn't exist when I'm staring at a blank page. I like editing, actually. So that's for me a calmer, easier process. I do take notes that I use later. I always have another document open where I put things that aren't fitting in, but I know that I want to potentially use later, or things that I've cut because I know they're not working, but I am too sad to erase. And I keep them aside. And I think, again, I only occasionally actually go back to it, but it just makes me feel more at peace with moving on from it. Do you do that, Nikki?
Completely. Yes. Every novel has a cut sections document.
Yeah.
Where I just dump things thinking that I'll take them back at some point. Some of our book, I mean, Nanny Diaries, we cut 100 pages.
Whoa.
I know, we could probably sell that. But it was just all the things that were too personal, didn't contribute to the story, didn't serve the greater good, and out of there.
Actually, yeah. I had to cut like an immense amount from Will You, Won't You, Want Me. It might have been something like that too. Yeah.
I would like those pages.
I'm curious. I'd be curious to go back actually, but yeah, it was way too long. Yeah. It does make you feel better.
How do you know when your book is done?
Oh, your book is never done. No. I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not joking. You know, there's the thing about writing, the challenging thing about writing, but also the, I guess, freeing thing about writing is that there's not one way to do anything. And there's no right answer. So although there are wrong answers. And so I think for me, I write a draft and I work it over like many times until I feel like it's in a strong enough place to show people. And there are certain people in my life, and those people have shifted a bit over time, depending on who I think actually has time in their life to do that kind of thing. Nikki is one of them, who I will give the book to and ask for feedback. And I am also fortunate enough, or have been fortunate enough, to have a small writing group. And so they will read it and give me feedback. And I'll do that. I'll go over that at least a few times with different readers before I would show it to like my agent. And then she decides when it's done. I'm joking, but like to an extent, you know, she says like, I think this isn't working, and I work with it. And then once we both feel like it's in a good place, that's when it would like go out to publishers. And then once it's out to publishers and you sell it, then you're dealing with an editor who also has feelings about that.
I just finished working on a book that I've worked on longer than I've ever worked on anything. And there was a certain part, I'm like, is this just my hobby now? Am I just going to be working on this like 20 years from now? Like, is this just what I do? And then I found with the last revision, this sense of calm settled over me where I could just feel, I was like, oh, I've said it. There's no other way to come at this. There's no thing I haven't thought of. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
Like, take it or leave it, love it or hate it. It now is what it is. With Emma and myself, when we were on a schedule and we had to deliver things, our clue together were two things. One, we would make a correction and then read a paragraph down and realize that couldn't be the thing we just changed it to for another reason. We'd have to change it back. And when we started to uncorrect our corrections, we're like, okay, we fiddled with this for too long.
We're done. Yeah.
And one of our printers would break. And that was the sign from the universe that it was time to stop. When smoke would start billowing out by, we're done. We're done now.
That was a sign from the universe that printers don't ever work. No, actually, I also think sometimes I don't have this with many things, but I have one manuscript that similarly doesn't ever totally feel done to me. And it haunts me a little. Like I always want to go back to it. And then it's always hard to know, like, is it worth it? Or is it better to move on to the next thing? And that's just something you have to personally assess, I think. You know,
yeah, those orphan children. I have many. What do you like to read when you're writing?
Okay, so I'm very particular about what I read when I'm writing. I'm afraid of like it being contagious. I don't know if this is because of years of working as a freelance writer. I've trained myself to adapt my voice in so many ways that I'm always afraid that if I read the wrong thing, I will adapt my voice in a bad way. And also once I've sort of got the story going in a certain rhythm, I'm afraid of it changing. So there are passages from, I'm like looking at my bookshelf. There are passages from certain books that I reread that are like my favorite passages ever. One that I have invoked before is from Tana French's first book. It's like at the very beginning. And it's just like, it's just the most evocative, like short paragraph. Yeah. And then there's also actually, there are passages from Everything is Illuminated that I reread, which I just like fell in love with. I know that like people have complicated feelings about that book, but there are just parts of that book that are so beautiful to me. So there are certain things that I will like. I just actually, I feel like I talk about this too much. It's like becoming weird and embarrassing, but I read Goodbye Vitamin this year. It's so good. And I really related to it also because it's a book that's also about something tragic, but that is told in this like direct, unique, really funny, smart way. And I just love that book so much that I found myself wanting to reread portions of that recently. Also just sort of for inspiration, but I'm open to reading like a book that's very different from what I'm doing when I'm writing, but not something that's similar at all, because that scares me.
That makes total sense. You mentioned the original idea came from real life events, but ultimately it's a work of fiction. Was it challenging separating fact from fiction, or did the fictional story take over once you got going? Also, what's your favorite plant-eating dinosaur?
Is that question from my 3-year-old son?
It might
be. I feel like I should start with the dinosaur. A diplodocus? Is that a thing? I think so.
Sounds like it.
Sure. Now I'm just like running through dinosaurs in my head. Once I started writing, I think that I was pretty quickly able to separate fact from fiction. I got like involved in the characters I was writing and the life that they were living. And I think I pretty quickly got absorbed in that. And it wasn't hard for me to separate in that way from my own experience. That said, even though the characters are characters, and even though the experience is related and is thematically the same, but is different, there are tiny pieces of things that are stolen from real life throughout it. Actually, I have not admitted this anywhere, but I think I will just say there are a few tiny little lines that were like written to me or said to me by my friend who I lost, Nick, that I included in the book. So Stewart isn't Nick. Their personalities are very different. Their experience is very different, but I endowed him with some of Nick's language occasionally. So I guess in that sense, there is fact in it, or there is sort of the real story, my story in it. And there were snippets of conversations I had during that time that I just was like, well, this has to go in the book, you know? But for the most part, once I started writing, the fictional characters took over, and I was more interested in their trajectory than in what happened. And also I wanted to escape from what happened at that point. I didn't want to live inside that. Part of the reason why you write a story, at least for me, I guess this isn't true for everyone. For me, part of the reason why I like to write these kinds of stories is because I like to be absorbed in them. Like I want to live with these characters for a little while and be in their world, you know? I want it to feel like an escape for me too.
The characters are so much more fun.
Yes, the characters are so much more fun.
You have a new book in the works.
Yes. It's in very nascent stages, but I do have, sorry, I just saw Diplodocus in the comments. So I'm like, yay. I do have a book in the works. It's a very different story, but I would say definitely in the same vein, like in the same sort of brand. It is very nascent. I wish I had more time to work on it right now because it's actually what I would love to be spending almost all my time doing. But I also haven't said this. I actually am co-writing a nonfiction book that's due in the middle of June, as Nikki knows. And so until that's done, I don't think I'm working on my book. But hopefully when that's done, I can sort of come back to the novel that I'm working on.
I hope so.
Yeah.
You're number one fan. There are some, I just want to make sure that I'm not reading questions that basically you've already answered in terms of balancing your own experience with the last two questions are, which I think you've answered. And so what has been your greatest takeaway from the experience of having lived through this and then creating this beautiful novel from your own experience? Or
thank you for calling it a beautiful novel. I think that one of the things that's happened, and I've said this before, and I want to keep saying it because I really want to encourage it. One of the things that's happened since I wrote this book is that people who are reading it are coming to me wanting to share their own stories about similar experiences of losing someone and of feeling like lost in the aftermath, and how of wanting to grieve in a quiet way, and of not being able to because of sort of this chaos that erupts, and the sense that somebody got to speak at a funeral but they shouldn't have been the person, and why did they think they were important, and this person didn't even really like that person, and whatever. It's a really common experience, and it's not one that gets talked about a lot. And it's really it's funny, and in some ways it's petty sometimes, parts of it, but it's also really painful. And so it's meant a lot to me that people have come to me and wanted to share their stories about it. And at one point, someone said to me, I wish I could remember who said this to me, but at one point someone said to me, all that anyone really wants is to feel seen. And that statement really stayed with me. And it gave me a lot more empathy for everybody involved, because it made me realize everybody actually feels the same way I do, which is I thought that I had this special relationship with this person, but it seems like he had so many special relationships. Was I important to him? What did he really, And I realized everyone doesn't express it in the best way, and I can't always be sympathetic about that, but the challenge is the same for many of us, and I think that's one of the takeaways. If I were in this situation again, I think I would just try to do everything in my power to reassure the people around me so that they didn't feel like they needed to compete. Yeah.
Have you changed as a writer from your first novel to now? And if so, how?
I mean, I hope so. I've gotten so much better. No, I don't know. Yeah, I think a first novel is kind of a funny thing. I mean, Nikki's first novel notwithstanding, most people kind of take a first, although actually speaking to you having to cut 100 pages out, most people's first novels it's kind of like a dump. I don't mean that in the way that it sounds. I mean, it's like a data dump, in the sense that you have all these things in your head and you just put them all in. And, sometimes even if you read, actually Everything is Illuminated is a great example. It's a beautiful book and there is so much going on in it. It feels like a first novel. And that's, I guess, I think hopefully, as you move forward as a writer, it becomes less and less about you trying to sort of work through all of these ideas and include all
thought you've ever had about everything ever.
ever.
In case you never say another thing ever for the rest of your life.
And more about, actually just wanting to tell that particular story. And I also think in the case of my books, my characters get older as I get older. I think my first book was a lot about like working through becoming an adult. And my second book was about like working through your 20s. And this book is really about, although they're all delayed coming of age stories, really, this book is about like life throwing you a curveball. And in many ways, in the case of Wren, like not settling for the status quo. Because in the story, like she's fine before this happens, but she's just fine. And like the question that it also sort of raises the question, like, is that really enough? Is being okay enough? So
it's interesting now looking back at the opening and Wren home watching The Bachelor. I mean, we've all been home watching The Bachelor with our cats for a year. So we're all sort of stuck in that place where it's like, how do we rejoin life? And I think that that's another level on which people will really be able to identify with her.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like, what is, now that we almost have like a new beginning in this weird sense, or like a new chance to emerge, albeit with a lot of baggage. And
a lot of hand sanitizer.
And sometimes masks. It's like, what will we do with that? What did we learn about? I mean, I know there are so many things for me. Like, what did I learn about the things that I don't want to go back to, and the things that I desperately do? So yeah, in that sense, it is.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. One of them is, the cover is so gorgeous. How involved were you in the marketing elements?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you, first of all. I love the cover too. In terms of the cover design, the designer that we worked with is so talented. She asked us to offer, or me, I guess, to offer some inspiration in terms of what I like. And so I went through and I found a bunch of book covers that just resonated with me. I explained to her that I like things to be like more text heavy. I didn't want it to be like a photograph on the cover. I felt strongly about that. And she came back with a bunch of very different concepts. One of which I kind of loved, but we ultimately decided it wasn't right. One of which was like a casserole. Like it was like the whole, I have it right here too. It was like the book was like a casserole with like you would give someone when somebody died, it was kind of brilliant. And then some of them were more literal. It was like silhouettes of Wren alone in a chair with people surrounding her, kind of almost in a ghostly way. It was also cool. Ultimately, we decided on this because of the theme of the vultures. And that's what Wren calls Stewart's who she feels questionable friends. As she feels like they're just like picking at his life. And so I love that as a theme. And we played with the idea of like seeing more of the bird or less. And ultimately we got here and then we picked various different colors and this is where we landed. And actually my friend Rachel, who may be on this chat or may not, who has a really good eye for graphic design. I went over it with her and had a conversation like, do you think things are laid out like in the right way? How would you do it? And she gave me feedback and worked more with the designer. And I think I was pretty annoying and rigorous with her, but ultimately we landed somewhere really beautiful and she did such a gorgeous job. I mean, I love it so much. And it really pops, which is nice.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think this is going to be our last question. Speaking of the vultures, which of the vultures was the most fun to craft?
Oh, So the vultures, as I said, for those who haven't read it, are people who Wren has known for a long time from being in Stewart's life, but who are not close friends of hers. But those people who are like, for so long that you know them well, but they've never really become your friends. That's who the vultures are, and Wren really struggles with all of them. And there's a series of them. There's one of them, Mallory, who in my mind is like the most benign of them. She's actually like a really nice person. She's just kind of like a little bit like clueless and like daffy. But she's funny. To me, like that was a really fun one to write because she doesn't control the modulation of her voice very well. And she means well, but she just is, sort of, I think always like saying the wrong thing. I don't know, but that was a fun one to write. And then the other one that I think was really fun to write is Blair, who is in some ways like Wren's greatest nemesis. But also becomes a more complicated character a bit as we go and learn a bit more about her and sort of her sense of desperation to be acknowledged.
You did a great job with giving each of them a very distinct flavor.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Like chamber music of awful when they were all together.
I like that. I'm going to use that.
Are there any final thoughts? Anything you want us to know before we finish?
No, I guess just that this was a book. I don't know. I sometimes feel silly saying this, but this is a book that for me was in part a tribute to my friend. And so it was really important to me that it just see the light of day. And like, I'm trying to hold on to that because when you publish a book in general, it's really challenging to let people know it exists. But in a pandemic, it's triply challenging. And so I guess I just am so grateful to everybody who's come here today to listen to this, and to everyone who's been really supportive about the book and enthusiastic and like just like loving and happy for me. And I really appreciate it because it's so nice after this difficult time to have a win, and so no matter what happens with the book, I feel like so grateful to be able to have this experience, even just sitting here talking to you. And so just that. And if people will spread the word, I would appreciate it. It would be great.
Spread the word, people.
Spread the word.
Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. And I'm going to let Book Soup come back to say their final words here.
Thank you both so much. This was such a great conversation. Really amazing for any aspiring writer or someone who's working on a book. Such a great wisdom there. Nora, congratulations on your next book, and really excited for you. And thank everyone for joining us tonight. I know it's Friday. Even in a pandemic, Fridays still feel like Fridays, I know, for a lot of people. So thank you for joining us virtually. And please purchase your copy of Competitive Grieving at the green button if you haven't yet. And either way, please support independent bookstores. And thank you both for being with us tonight. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you.
Bye.